Hello, this is Cynthia Douthit, and I want to welcome you to this fourth portion of the Torah classes. And again, each week I'm trying to do a short teaching of each portion. And again, we know that the Bible, the first 5 books of the Bible, Torah, that has been divided into what is referred to as parashahs, or portions. And so I'm doing a teaching each week so people can kind of keep up with this, and it's going to be a year long. So I hope you'll join me on this journey as we go through the first 5 books of the Bible in 1 year. Now, what we looked at last week a little bit in Torah Portion 3 was about this son of promise. We've been looking at Abraham and Sarah. And so we know that Sarah was barren, and her and Abraham wanted to have a child together. And of course, many years had passed and she was not able to. And in that culture, Abraham could have divorced her, but he showed his love to her and he kept her as a wife. And so they both had advanced in years. She was through menopause and he was quite mature also. And so we see that with the story of Avraham and Sarai, they both had a name change. They were Avraham and Sarai, and so they become Avraham and Sarah. And so the H, the He, which is seen as the breath of God, was put in their name. So they've had a name change, and their bodies have been restored to a more youthful body so that they can have this son of promise. And we know the son of promise is going to be Isaac and Yitzhak, and Yitzhak means laughter. And I think, too, a lot of us would laugh if we were, in our 80s or 90s and found out that we were going to have a baby. I might do a little more than laugh, might need to cry a little bit. But as we are in Torah Portion 4, we're going to be looking at the binding of Isaac, Genesis 22. I just really love this story every year when I read it, and I study it more than just once a year. But when I go through and I read it, I really see the patterns and parallels of the story of Avraham the father and Isaac the son. And Isaac is the son of promise. And so this is the pattern and the parallel of God the Father and Jesus, Yeshua, the Son. So we're just going to go through here, and I want to be mindful of our time, because I know a lot of times people don't want to sit 20, 30, 40 minutes in front of the computer. So we're going to go through, and I might have to do part 2, just not too sure. But Genesis 22, this is called the binding of Isaac, the Akedah, the Akedah. And it says, after these things, God tested Avraham. Now, God knew what Abraham was going to do. Nothing takes God by surprise. But this was really to prove to Abraham how much strength and faith he had. And of course, we can look in the book of Hebrews and really see how much faith he had. But after these things, God tested Abraham, and he said to him, Abraham. And he answered, Hineni, here I am. And he said, take your son, your only son, whom you love, Yitzhak, Isaac, laughter, and go to the land of Moriah. So here we see that the land of Moriah, this is where Jerusalem is. It's the mountain range. And so this is where Avraham and Isaac, the son of promise, the promised son, and Abraham knew that the promise that Adonai said, that all of his descendants would come through Isaac, not through Ishmael, although Ishmael would have 12 sons and many tribes. But we see this is Isaac is the son of promise. So it's about setting out. So and he says, you're to go to the land of Moriah, and there you two are to offer him as a burnt offering on a mountain that I will point out to you. Now, interesting, up until this time, we know about sacrifices. We've seen that Cain and Abel sacrificed. We saw that Noah sacrificed. We see that Avraham has built altars. But we have never been given the instructions where it says, this is how you do a burnt offering. We get that later on when we get over into Leviticus. But we know a burnt offering is when you take an offering, an animal, and you slice its throat, you drain the blood, you skin it, you field dress it, basically. You take its guts out, you inspect it, and then you flay it, and you lay it on this altar, and you burn it up. And this is what God was asking Abraham to do. Now, as we go along through here, we will see that Isaac was not this little boy like you see painted in pictures or drawn. He was a young man in his late 20s, early 30s. So he was old enough to just tell his father, you know what, I'm not going along with this. But we see again, patterns and parallels. God the Father, Abraham the father, and then we see Isaac the son of promise, and Yeshua Jesus, the son of promise. So they go on, and he is supposed to be a burnt offering. Abraham got up early in the morning, saddled his donkey, took 2 of his young men with him. And again, we see this picture of even Yeshua hanging on the execution stake, the cross. There were 2 one on either side of him, or that's at least the way the picture's drawn. They both might have been on the same side, I don't know. But they get up, and Abraham saddles a donkey, and he took 2 of his young men with him, together with Isaac his son. He cut the wood for the burnt offering, departed, and went to the place God had told him about. Now, one of the things that we see in the scripture, many times, I'd have to double check to make sure it's 100% of the time, but what we see often in Torah, when it says the place God will show you, the place I will show you, ultimately that becomes Jerusalem. That becomes the Temple Mount. That becomes the place that we see where God will set his name. And when we see an aerial view, we see the Shin, which many of you know, Spock, for El Shaddai. And so the Shin is for El Shaddai, the name of God that appeared, who appeared to Avraham. When God would deal with Abraham, and he tells Moses, he said, I reveal myself to Abraham as El Shaddai. So here we see that he says, go to the place that I will tell you about. On the 3rd day, Abraham raised his eyes and he saw the place in a distance. And again, on the 3rd day, and we know Yeshua Jesus rose from the dead on the 3rd day. So keep the pattern parallel going here. So on the 3rd day, Abraham raised his eyes and he saw the place in the distance. And Abraham said to the young men, stay here with the donkey. The boy and I will go there, worship, and return to you. And Abraham took the wood for the burnt offering and laid it on Isaac, his son. And again, we know that Yeshua Jesus carried his own instrument of death. He carried the wooden cross. Now, some people think it was a cross, like we see, or some people think it was just the main cross beam that his arms would have been nailed to. But anyway, Isaac is carrying the wood, basically the instrument of death, because he's going to be a burnt offering, and Yeshua Jesus carried the wood, the cross. So we see that Abraham puts this wood, he lays it on Isaac, his son, and then he took in his hand the fire and the knife, and they both went on together. So we see a picture of the Father and the Son walking together in unity to go to the place where God has told them to make this offering or this sacrifice. Basically, Isaac's going to be a living sacrifice. Isaac spoke to his father, and he says, my father? And he answered, Hineni, here I am, my son. And he said, I see the fire and the wood, but where is the lamb for a burnt offering? So they knew about the lamb. Now, one of the things I want to remind us about is God often teaches with lessons of his coming son through the sacrifices of animals. We take the lamb into our home on Nisan 10 when we're looking at the Passover Seder. And then we think of how that lamb loved us and how we, had it in our home. And then we take that lamb on Nisan 14, Preparation Day, and the lamb is killed. Now, we don't do that here. The only place you can sacrifice is in Jerusalem on the Temple Mount when the temple is standing. But biblically, this is what we would see. So we see God is teaching the lessons of the coming of his son through these sacrifices and the dealings with the animals. So he says, I see everything, but where's the lamb for a burnt offering? And Abraham replied, God will provide himself the lamb. And we know Yeshua Jesus is the Son of God. And we know that he is the lamb that was slain before the foundations of the earth. So he says, God will provide himself the lamb for a burnt offering, my son. And they both went on together. And so we see again, father and son going in unity to basically for the same goal. And that's the picture of God the Father and Yeshua Jesus the Son. Their plan of salvation was worked out before the earth was ever put into place. The Bible tells us that Yeshua Jesus was the lamb slain before the foundations of the earth. So the plan of salvation was there before creation ever was. So the Father and the Son, so to speak, were in agreement, unity, that Jesus would come in the fullness of time and that he would die on the execution stake, the cross for us. They came to the place that God had told him about, and Abraham built the altar, set the wood in order, bound Isaac his son, and he laid him on the altar on the wood. Now again, he wasn't a little boy. He was, in his 20s, maybe early 30s. And so when we look at, the time frame, so we see here that the father is basically in charge, but Isaac, this young man, was willing to go along with what his father was asking him to do. Again, patterns and parallels. God the Father, Yeshua Jesus the Son, the story of Abraham the father, and Isaac the son. So he lays him on the altar of wood, and then Abraham put out his hand and took the knife to kill his son. But the angel of Adonai called out, Abraham, Abraham, and he answered, Hineni, here I am. He says, for now I know that you are a man who fears God, because you have not withheld your son, your only son, from me. So again, we see this test really was for Abraham, because God knew that he was going to go through with this. But what we see is, since he was willing to sacrifice his only begotten son, it was as if he accomplished it. So here Abraham expected for his son to be that burnt offering that day, on that third day. And so with the stay of the hand, it was as if Isaac was resurrected from the dead. Now, as we look at this again, this picture of Abraham and Isaac, patterns and parallels. And he says, I know you are a man who fears God, because you have not withheld your son, your only son, from me. Abraham raised his eyes and looked, and there behind him was a ram caught in a thorn bush. And again, they thought they were going to have a lamb. It wasn't the fullness of time yet. Yeshua Jesus was the lamb that would basically die on the Mount Moriah mountain range. And so, and that is in Jerusalem. So what they have is a ram that is caught by the brow in a thicket of thorns. And we see that Yeshua Jesus, the lamb, was placed upon his brow a crown from a thorn bush, both picturing the sins of the world. So the ram is caught in the bushes by its horns. Abraham took it, offered it as a burnt offering, and placed it as son, a substitution. Yeshua Jesus, when he died on the cross, he was my substitution, and he was your substitution. So we start seeing this pattern, the parallel of the coming of a lamb who will be a substitute for a person's life. And again, it's the picture that God is using these animals and sacrifices to teach about the coming of his son, so people would understand what was taking place and identify the prophecy. So we see here next, it says that Abraham called the place Adonai Yireh, Adonai will see, Adonai provides. The angel of Adonai called to Abraham a second time, and he said, I have sworn by myself, says Adonai. And again, Adonai is the word, or the letters, Yud He Vav He, the 4 Hebrew letters that make up the Tetragrammaton. So when you have Lord, capital L-O-R-D, or you see Adonai, that is Yud He Vav He. Philippians 2:11 says Yeshua Jesus is Lord, meaning Yeshua Jesus is Adonai, Yud He Vav He, Messiah unto the glory of God. So here we see Yeshua in this chapter 22 of Genesis, and he speaks to Avraham, and he says, because you have done this, because you haven't withheld your son, your only son, I most certainly will bless you. Now, as we look at this, we'll look a little bit more at the patterns and the parallels. We see that this is the binding of Isaac. It is the killing of the promised offspring. And we know that Yeshua Jesus He was also the promised offspring. He was the son of promise. And we see that all the way back in Genesis 1, verses 2, 3, and 4. Isaac, his name Yitzhak, means laughter. This child of laughter, this story turns to sorrow. He's supposed to be the burnt offering. And they get up there, and the son and the father are walking along together. What we see when we look at the story in Genesis 22 is the story of two fathers. One is willing to give his son to God, and the other is God the Father that is willing to give his son in your place and my place. The ram is caught in the thorn bush, and Yeshua Jesus has the thorn crown upon his brow. We see what Isaac and what Abraham was going to do was a sacrifice of obedience that pleased the Father. We see the Father and the Son working together in unison, and that's what we see when we study out the picture of Yeshua Jesus. He said, I'm about my Father's business. You've seen me, you've seen the Father. You know, the Father and I are one. We are Ehad. We are in unity. Genesis 22 is the foreshadow of God the Father and his Son, showing obedience for the sacrifice. Isaac was not a little boy, but he was willing to be obedient to his father. You know, it was not the right time for the lamb, and we see the substitute in the form of a ram. The place that they went, Hamakom, was Mount Moriah, and that is in Jerusalem. We know that Yeshua was executed, sacrificed, went to the cross in this very area. We see that there were two young men with Abraham and Isaac, and there were two men with Yeshua on the cross. Abraham was following the instructions, and by following the instructions, he was hitting the mark. We've talked about that in previous Torah classes. Isaac also was following the instructions. He was honoring his father, and he basically was keeping the fifth commandment. Honor your father and mother, so it will go well with you, so your days will be long. The fifth commandment has a promise of life. We see in Genesis 22, the Father and the Son were in unity, and Yeshua Jesus, the Son, and God the Father are in unity. The scripture tells us that the Father did not withhold his Son, and God the Father did not withhold his Son from us. You know, Sarah was past childbearing age. She had been through menopause. And Mary was a virgin birth. Both women were exceptions here. One had gone through menopause and wasn't supposed to be able to have a child. And one was a virgin who had never had sex with a man, thus she should not have had a child. The binding of Isaac is the foreshadow of Messiah, Yeshua Jesus. Thank you for joining me this week, and next week we'll look at the death of Sarah. It's a sad story, but it's also a good story. It's a love story of a husband and a wife. If you have any questions, comments, please post. Say hi to me so I'll know you're out there. Thank you for joining me, and I hope you'll join me next week as we're in portion 5, the life of Sarah. But it's about her death. But normally when someone dies, we remember their life, a testimony of how they lived. Thank you for joining me, and hope to see you again. Shalom.